The chamber floated in the void between stars. A massive structure built by 17 different species over 3,000 years of cooperation and expansion across the galaxy. And inside this ancient hall, the High Council of the Galactic Hegemony gathered to decide the fate of an insignificant species on the edge of explored space. Ambassador Velshara of the Vexstar Crystalline Collective stood before the assembled representatives, her translucent body refracting the light from 100 different worlds into rainbow patterns across the polished floor as she presented the data streams that had been collected over the past solar cycle. The species calls themselves humans, she began, her voice resonating through quantum channels that every species present could understand, regardless of their native communication methods. And they have achieved faster-than-light capability through what our analysts describe as brute force engineering, rather than elegant physics. The holographic display showed a blue and green world orbiting a yellow star, third planet in an unremarkable system that the humans had designated Sol after their stellar body. And around this world, dozens of primitive vessels moved in chaotic patterns that violated every principle of efficient spacelane management the hegemony had established over millennia of galactic civilization. Of Coordinator Ku, Raish spoke next. The collective consciousness of 3 billion individual organisms unified into a single purpose and voice that echoed from the organic speakers embedded in the walls around them. We have observed their expansion into neighboring systems, Kresh stated flatly, showing images of human colonies on frozen moons and barren rocks that no sensible species would consider worth the resources to terraform. And their behavior patterns match 7 of the 9 warning indicators we established after the Kresh incident. A ripple of unease passed through the assembled delegates because everyone remembered the Kresh and how a single aggressive species had destabilized an entire sector before the hegemony had been forced to sterilize their worlds from orbit. After 2 centuries of devastating warfare, the Kryn delegation stirred in their section of the chamber, and Fleet Commander Shotharone rose to his full 3 meters of height, his scaled hide bearing the scars of 100 campaigns, and his 4 eyes focusing on the display with the cold calculation that had made him the most successful military commander in hegemony history. What is their technological classification? Shotharone asked, already running tactical simulations in the combat processor implanted in his brainstem. Class 7 emerging, Velshara replied, manipulating the hologram to show schematics of human warships that looked more like armored boxes with engines attached than proper vessels, designed according to physics and aesthetics. Their weapons are primarily kinetic projectiles and primitive fusion devices, and their defensive capabilities rely on ablative armor rather than energy shielding. The coordinator of the Sylph Collective, beings of pure energy who had transcended physical form 8,000 years ago, pulsed with what translated as confusion in the common language. Then why do we concern ourselves with such primitives? The Sylph asked, genuine puzzlement in the electromagnetic fluctuations that carried their meaning. Surely they pose no threat to the hegemony or any of our member species for at least 1,000 of their years. Ambassador Velshara shifted the display again, and now it showed human communications intercepts, raw data streams that the translation algorithms had processed into understandable content. And what those communications revealed made several delegates lean forward with sudden interest. Observe their cultural patterns, she said, as the display played audio and video from human broadcasts, news programs, entertainment media, and military communications that painted a picture of a species fundamentally different from anything the hegemony had encountered. Before, the recordings showed humans fighting each other over resources and ideologies and territories on their own homeworld, conflicts that had raged for their entire stereo, recorded history with weapons that grew progressively more devastating as their technology advanced. And yet between these conflicts, they created art and music and literature that spoke of cooperation and unity and dreams of peaceful exploration among the stars. They are paradoxical, Kresh observed, the hive mind processing thousands of data points simultaneously. to reach conclusions that individual species would take months to formulate. They speak of peace while preparing for war. They advocate for cooperation while competing against each other. And they express horror at violence while glorifying warriors in their cultural narratives. Jothrone watched a recording of human soldiers in combat on their own world. Primitive firearms and explosives used with a ferocity that seemed excessive for conflicts over such minor territorial disputes. And he noted how these humans fought not with the disciplined formations the hegemony taught its forces, but with desperate improvisational tactics that adapted to changing circumstances with remarkable speed. They are survivors, the fleet commander said quietly, recognizing something in the way human combatants moved and reacted that spoke to instincts honed over millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Their world has tried to kill them since they first developed consciousness, and they have learned to fight everything, including each other. The display shifted again to show human colony ships heading toward nearby star systems. Slow vessels by hegemony standards, but numerous and persistent, spreading outward from their homeworld, like seeds scattered by wind across a field that might grow into something beautiful or something terrible, depending on what nutrients. The soil-provided population projections suggest they will have established permanent settlements in 12 systems. Within 50 years, Belshara continued, her crystalline structure resonating with frequencies that indicated concern bordering on alarm. And their rate of technological advancement shows exponential growth curves that exceed anything we have observed in species at similar development stages. A debate erupted among the delegates, with some arguing for observation and cautious contact while others insisted on immediate containment protocols. And the chamber filled with voices speaking in dozens of languages, all translated through the quantum network into a cacophony of opinions and concerns, and fears about what these humans might become if left unchecked. Finally, the Prime Arbiter called for order. The ancient being whose species had founded the hegemony when most current members were still swimming in primordial oceans on their homeworlds. And silence fell across the chamber as everyone waited for wisdom accumulated over tens of thousands of years of galactic politics. We have seen what happens when aggressive species reach the stars, the Prime Arbiter said in a voice that carried the weight of civilizations that had risen and fallen under hegemony guidance. And we have learned that prevention costs fewer lives than cure when dealing with existential threats too. Galactic stability. The vote was called and tallied through the quantum network in seconds. Representatives of 47 species making the decision that would determine the fate of humanity without any human present to speak in their own defense or plead their case or explain that they were more than the violent broadcasts and military buildups that the hegemony observed from afar. The result was unanimous, and the resolution passed without a single dissenting voice among the assembled. Powers of the galaxy humanity would be contained through military force, their expansion halted, their colonies seized or destroyed, and their homeworld placed under hegemony control to prevent future threats to galactic stability and peace. Fleet Commander Jathrone received his orders within the hour. Command of a battle fleet that numbered 3,000 warships crewed by veteran soldiers from a dozen different species, all equipped with weapons and shields and tactical systems that represented the pinnacle of technology accumulated over millennia of advancement. The invasion would begin in 30 standard cycles, time enough to position forces and establish supply lines and prepare for what every tactical simulation suggested would be a brief and decisive campaign against a species that had barely learned to leave their own star system. As Jathrone returned to his flagship to begin preparations, he reviewed the intelligence files on humanity one more time, studying their history and culture and the way they had fought their countless wars against each other with increasing brutality as their weapons grew more powerful. Something about the data troubled him, though he could not identify exactly what. Some pattern in the chaos that his combat-trained mind recognized but could not articulate. Like a scent on the wind that warned of danger approaching from beyond the visible horizon, he dismissed the feeling as pre-battle nerves common even among experienced commanders, and began issuing orders to his subordinates, setting in motion the machinery of war that would bring overwhelming force against an enemy the hegemony had already decided could not possibly resisting 30 cycles. The fleet would arrive at human space and deliver the hegemony's ultimatum: surrender or face extinction. No one aboard those 3,000 warships. Imagine for a moment that humanity might choose a third option. The hegemony fleet emerged from faster-than-light transit at the edge of what humans called the Kuiper Belt. 3,000 warships materializing in perfect formation, like a plague of metal locusts descending upon crops ready for harvest. And the display of coordinated power would have impressed any species that understood the mathematics of void combat fleet. Commander Shea Theron stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Conquest, watching tactical displays that showed human detection systems scrambling to track the sudden appearance of so many vessels in their outer solar system. And he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at the precision his forces had demonstrated in the jump. All vessels report ready status. His second-in-command announced, a Quoleth subcoordinator whose hive share allowed rapid processing of information from hundreds of ships simultaneously. Long-range sensors detect minimal human military presence in the outer system as predicted. The intelligence had been accurate because humans had concentrated their defensive forces closer to their colonies and homeworld, leaving the outer reaches of their system relatively unprotected, except for automated monitoring stations and a handful of patrol vessels that were already broadcasting frantic warnings toward the inner planet Za. Theron activated the communication array and transmitted the hegemony's message in all known human languages, a declaration that had been carefully crafted by the diplomatic corps to offer terms that seemed generous while ensuring total submission. Humans of the Sol system, his translated voice boomed across every frequency. Humans used for communication, you are hereby notified that your species has been evaluated by the galactic hegemony and found to pose a potential threat to galactic stability and peace. Effective immediately, all human vessels and colonies beyond your homeworld must surrender to hegemony authority and accept permanent governance. Resistance will be met with overwhelming force. You have one standard solar rotation to comply. The response came faster than expected. Not from Earth's government, but from a Terran Defense Force cruiser that had been patrolling near Neptune's orbit. And the human commander's face appeared on the view screen with an expression. Joe Theron's cultural database identified as contempt. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the TDF Defiant, the human said. Her voice steady, despite facing a fleet that outnumbered her vessel 3,000 to 1. And I have a message for your hegemony. Go to hell. The communication cut off, and the human ship's engines flared to full burn, accelerating directly toward the hegemony formation in what tactical analysis classified as a suicide run, because no single vessel could possibly damage even one ship in a fleet of this magnitude. Interesting, Jadharon murmured, watching the approach vector and calculating that the humans must know. This action would accomplish nothing except their own destruction. Destroy the vessel, but attempt to minimize damage. We may want to study the wreckage particle beams lanced out from 3 nearby cruisers. Precise shots that should have vaporized the human ship's engines and left the hull intact for recovery. But the Defiant's commander had anticipated the targeting patterns and rolled her vessel at the last second, so the beams struck less critical sections. Human ship continued its charge, and now Jadharon understood what Chen intended. Because the Defiant was heading straight for his flagship on a collision course that would require lethal force to prevent, she means to ram us, his second-in-command stated unnecessarily, already directing more ships to fire on the approaching threat. Defiant died under concentrated bombardment from a dozen vessels, its hull breaching in multiple locations in its reactor, going critical in a flash of fusion fire that briefly outshone nearby stars. But in its final moments, the human crew launched every missile and kinetic projectile they carried not at the flagship, but at a nearby destroyer whose shields were reconfiguring. After firing 2 missiles penetrated the destroyer's defenses and detonated against its hull. Primitive nuclear warheads that the hegemony had abandoned centuries ago, but which still released enough energy to crack armor, plating and caused secondary explosions in weapon magazines. The destroyer began listing with its gravitational stabilizers, damaged and crew struggling to contain fires in 3 separate sections. Not destroyed, but wounded in a way. It would require it to return to fleet support vessels for repairs. First blood to the humans, Shathrone said quietly, studying the tactical display and revising his initial assessment of how this campaign would proceed. Over the following weeks, the fleet advanced toward the inner system and encountered more resistance at every asteroid mining station and orbital facility humanity had established beyond Earth, and each engagement followed similar patterns that troubled Jathrone more than he cared to admit to his subordinates. The humans never surrendered, even when surrounded and outgunned by forces that should have convinced any rational commander to preserve their crew's lives. Instead, they fought until their ships broke apart, or until they deliberately crashed them into hegemony vessels, or detonated their reactors in close proximity to create damage through sheer explosive force. At the Ceres colony, the hegemony demanded evacuation and submission, but the human defenders refused and fortified the entire asteroid into a weapon platform, forcing Jathrone to commit significant forces to assault what should have been a minor way station on the path to Earth. The battle for Ceres lasted 6 days and cost the hegemony 18 ships destroyed and 43 damaged. Losses that tactical simulations had predicted would be the total for the entire campaign. And when hegemony forces finally breached the colony's defenses, they found the remaining humans had rigged the entire facility with explosives. Blast killed 3,000 hegemony troops, who had boarded to secure the station, and destroyed enough material that the colony was worthless for future use. And in the wreckage, recovery teams found a message painted on a wall in human blood that simply read, "Remember Ceres." The propaganda effect rippled through human space as broadcasts from Earth and the colonies showed the Ceres defenders as martyrs who had chosen death over submission. And recruitment for the Terran Defense Force increased 300% in the days following the battle at Proxima Station. The pattern repeated with variations that suggested humans were learning and adapting their tactics based on previous engagements. And Jathrone watched in growing frustration as every victory cost more resources and more time than his carefully calculated invasion schedule allowed. The station's defenders used the civilian population as shields in a way that violated every hegemony law of warfare, placing military installations inside hospitals and schools and residential sections so that any attack would cause massive non-combatant casualties. When Jathrone demanded they relocate civilians to safety, the human commander laughed and explained that every civilian on the station had volunteered to stay. That children as young as 10 were loading ammunition, and that doctors had converted their medical facilities into bomb-making workshops. You don't understand us, the commander said during negotiations that were clearly just buying time for the humans to prepare more defenses. We're not soldiers following orders. We're people defending our homes and our children's future. And we will use every advantage we have, including your own moral restrictions, against you. The assault on Proxima Station became a nightmare of close-quarters combat in corridors where hegemony technological advantages meant nothing against humans, who knew every inch of their station, and who used improvised weapons with creative brutality that no tactical manual had prepared. The fleet soldiers to counter Satharan forces secured the station after losing 200 personnel to booby traps and ambushes, and when they finally cornered the last human defenders in the station's command center, those humans activated a previously undetected antimatter device that destroyed an entire section and killed everyone in the blast radius, including themselves. The fleet commander stood in his ready room reviewing casualty reports that showed losses exceeding projections by 400%, and he could not explain to the High Council why a Class 7 species with primitive weapons was inflicting such damage on the most advanced military force the galaxy had ever Assembled, they fight like they have nothing to lose, his second-in-command observed during the staff briefing. Our psychological warfare specialists cannot find any leverage to convince them surrender is preferable to death. Shathrone pulled up intercepted human communications and played them for his officers. Recordings of messages between colonies and ships and families on Earth that revealed something his species had never encountered in 3 centuries of warfare. The humans were afraid, and they knew they were outmatched, and they understood logically that resistance was futile. But they fought anyway, not because they believed they could win, but because the alternative was unacceptable to something fundamental in their nature, requesting reinforcements. Jotharon transmitted to the High Council, knowing the request would be seen as weakness, but unable to deny the mathematics of attrition that said his fleet would be combatant effective before reaching Earth at this rate of losses. 18 months into what should have been a 3-month campaign, the hegemony fleet crawled through human space like a wounded beast dragging itself toward prey that kept inflicting new injuries with every meter of distance covered. And Fleet Commander Shathrone no longer recognized the neat formations and efficient tactics his forces had demonstrated at the war's beginning. The tactical display showed his remaining ships spread across multiple engagement zones because humans had abandoned any pretense of conventional warfare and now attacked supply convoys, isolated patrols, and even damaged vessels limping back toward fleet support stations. Another logistics transport lost in the asteroid belt. His second-in-command reported with the flat tone that indicated the hive share was struggling to process the continuous stream of bad news. Human raiders used chemical rocket boosters to accelerate rocks into the convoy's path and destroyed 2 cargo vessels before our escorts could respond. Jotharon studied the report and noted the humans had killed those 2 ships, using technology his own ancestors might have employed 10,000 years ago. Simple kinetic weapons that cost almost nothing to manufacture, but which forced the hegemony to divert precious warship assets to guard every supply run. Increase escort strength. 2 for combat vessels per convoy, he ordered, knowing this would further strain his already overextended forces, but unable to accept the loss rates on logistics that currently threatened to starve his fleet of ammunition. In reactor fuel, the war had become something no hegemony commander had experienced in living memory, a grinding attrition battle where technological superiority meant less with each passing week, because humans adapted and improvised and found ways to turn their weaknesses into weapons. At Mars, the human defenders had converted the entire terraforming infrastructure into a weapon system, redirecting atmospheric processors to create toxic gas clouds that corroded hegemony ship hulls, and using massive industrial lasers designed for mining operations as point defense against incoming missiles. The battle for Mars cost Getharon 300 ships and 8 weeks of constant combat before his forces secured the orbital space, but the surface remained contested because human colonies had gone underground and continued launching attacks from hidden bunkers scattered across thousands of kilometers of rust-red desert. They are fighting from inside civilian shelters, the Quoleth coordinator reported after another failed attempt to clear a section of the Martian surface. Our troops breach a position only to find it was a school or hospital, and the humans have already relocated their military assets to new locations. The rules of engagement prohibited bombardment of civilian targets, but humans had deliberately erased the distinction between military and civilian infrastructure. And Jotharon faced a choice between committing war crimes or accepting that portions of Mars would remain hostile indefinitely. Chose to leave garrison forces on Mars and continue toward Earth because the High Council's demands for progress had become threats of replacing him with a commander more willing to use extreme measures. But the decision meant leaving enemy forces behind his advance in violation of every principle of strategic warfare. Asteroid Belt had become a lawless the zone where human raiders operated with impunity from secret bases hidden among millions of rocks and hegemony patrols found themselves ambushed by enemies who knew the territory and who disappeared into the stellar debris before pursuit could organize. We are fighting a guerrilla war across an entire solar system, Jatharona's tactical officer observed during a strategy session. And our doctrine has no protocols for this kind of distributed resistance. Intelligence reports painted an even grimmer picture of what waited ahead because Earth itself had undergone transformation. That satellites and long-range sensors could barely comprehend in scope and speed the blue world that had appeared so peaceful in initial surveys now bristled with weapon emplacements and orbital defense platforms and ship construction. Facilities that covered entire continents in industrial sprawl, and the rate of human military production had increased exponentially as their whole civilization converted to total war economy. This are building ships faster than we can destroy them, the intelligence coordinator reported, displaying production figures that showed human shipyards launching new vessels every few days. Crude designs compared to hegemony warships, but numerous enough to matter in the brutal mathematics of attrition. Orfarazatharan examined the designs and noted how human engineering had evolved during the war. Early vessels had been exploration ships hastily armed with whatever weapons could be fitted. But newer models showed purpose-built warship construction, with heavier armor and more powerful reactors and missile batteries that could threaten even hegemony cruisers if they achieved optimal firing positions. Where are they getting the resources? He asked. Because metal and rare elements required for ship construction should have been limited by the supply sources the hegemony had already captured or destroyed. The answer came from a captured human logistics officer who laughed when asked about resource constraints and explained that Earth's population had surrendered every luxury to feed the war machine. Civilians had donated their vehicles for melting into ship hulls and their electronics for components, and even their jewelry for trace elements used in reactor construction. Every person on Earth is part of the war effort, the prisoner said with pride that seemed insane given his circumstances. Children collect scrap metal, elderly operate factory equipment, and everyone from corporate executives to homeless people work together for one purpose, just to make you invaders pay for every kilometer you advance. The cultural analysis team studied human propaganda broadcasts and found a civilization that had unified in ways their fractured political systems suggested should be impossible. Ancient enemies had set aside centuries of conflict to face the common threat, and democratic governments had transformed into war councils with singular focus on survival and resistance. They call it total mobilization, the cultural expert explained to Jatharon during a briefing, and it represents a complete restructuring of their society around military production and defense. Every economic activity, every social structure, every aspect of human life now serves the war effort. Video footage showed human cities transformed with factories running constant shifts and workers sleeping in cots beside their machines to maximize production time. Farmland had been converted to manufacturing. Centers with food production moved to vertical farms and algae tanks that fed populations minimal nutrition calculated to sustain. Workforce efficiency schools had become training centers where children learned weapons, maintenance, and tactical basics alongside traditional education. And retirement homes had organized elderly humans into support roles, manufacturing, ammunition components, and monitoring communications networks. Hegemony had expected a civilized surrender once humans understood resistance was futile, but instead they faced a species that had apparently decided death was preferable to subjugation and had oriented every aspect of their existence toward making that death as costly as possible for their enemies. Jupiter's orbital space, the pattern repeated, on larger scale with human forces, using the massive planet's gravity well and radiation belts to negate hegemony technological advantages, and the battle became a chaotic mess of hit-and-run attacks, where humans emerged from the radiation storms to launch missiles and then disappeared before return fire could lock on. They are using their own system against us, Jatharon observed with something approaching admiration for the tactical creativity. turning natural hazards into weapons because they know this terrain better than we can learn it. The Jupiter engagement cost another 200 ships and 3 months of maneuvering before Gemini forces secured the orbital space. But several human battle groups escaped toward the inner system and would surely reinforce. Earth's defensive supply lines now stretched across billions of kilometers with constant harassment from human raiders. And the logistics officers reported that maintaining the fleet at current operations tempo required resource commitments, exceeding initial projections by factor of 7. We are winning. The Quelith coordinator observed during a command meeting, but the cost of each victory grows higher, and the humans show no signs of accepting inevitable defeat. Jotharon studied casualty figures that showed he had lost 60% of his original fleet. Strength with Earth still ahead. And reinforcement requests had been denied 3 times because the High Council claimed no additional forces were available without weakening defenses in other sectors. The political situation back in hegemony space was deteriorating because member species had expected a quick campaign and instead faced mounting casualties and resource drains with no clear end in sight. Some representatives were openly questioning whether containing humanity was worth the cost when the hegemony had more pressing concerns in other regions. How much longer? Jethron asked his tactical team, studying the projections for reaching Earth orbit and establishing invasion positions at current rate of advance another 6 months minimum. Came the response. And that assumes human resistance does not increase further as we approach their homeworld. Earth hung in the view screen like a blue jewel surrounded by a halo of metal and fire. Orbital defense platforms and weapon satellites and ship construction yards that transformed the planet's immediate space into the most heavily fortified position Fleet Commander Zatharon had encountered in 3 centuries of military service. 22 months since the war began, and his fleet had finally reached humanity's homeworld. But the force that arrived bore little resemblance to the armada that had emerged at the system's edge with overwhelming confidence and superior technology. Of 3,000 warships, only 1,200 remained combat effective, the rest destroyed, or damaged beyond field repair, or sent back to hegemony. Space with casualties that required medical facilities the fleet could not provide. And those 1,200 ships showed where from constant combat that made maintenance crews despair. All vessels report ready for final assault, his second-in-command announced with hollow formality, because everyone knew. The fleet was operating at fraction of optimal capability. Orbital bombardment solutions prepared, and ground invasion forces standing by. Jotharon studied the tactical display and saw Earth's defenses arrayed in layers that would require systematic reduction before landing troops became feasible. Hundreds of orbital platforms with overlapping firing solutions, and thousands of human ships positioned to interdict any approach vector. Begin bombardment of military targets, he ordered, knowing this command would kill millions, but unable to see alternative that would not cost even more lives. When ground forces deployed, the fleet's particle beams and graviton weapons lanced down toward Earth's surface, targeting the obvious military installations and ship construction facilities and power generation stations that fed the planet's war machine. And for 3 hours, the bombardment continued until atmosphere glowed with the heat of energy weapons, burning through air molecules. When the firing stopped, Jethron expected to see significant damage to Earth's military infrastructure. But reconnaissance scans showed something that made his combat-trained instincts scream warnings. His conscious mind struggled to articulate the humans had anticipated orbital bombardment and built their critical facilities underground or dispersed them throughout civilian population centers where hegemony rules of engagement prohibited targeting. And what the fleet had destroyed were decoy installations and abandoned structures that had drawn fire away from real military assets. They sacrificed empty buildings to waste our ammunition, tactical officer reported with disbelief in his voice. And now, our magazines are depleted by 30%, with minimal actual damage to their capabilities. The fleet's supply situation was already critical after 2 years of combat, far from hegemony logistics bases, and wasting ammunition on decoys meant rationing what remained for the battles ahead. Human ships emerged from Earth's orbital space in wave formations that ignored casualties and focused on overwhelming local defenses through sheer numbers. Crude vessels that died easily but kept coming in swarms that forced hegemony ships to expend missiles and energy weapon charges at unsustainable rates. They are trading ships for our ammunition, Jatharon realized, watching the tactical display. Showed dozens of human vessels destroyed for every hegemony ship damaged, and they can build replacements faster than we can resupply. The mathematics of attrition had reversed because humans fought in their home system with production facilities and resources immediately available while the hegemony fleet operated. At the end of supply lines stretching across light years of hostile space after 6 hours of continuous combat, the human attack waves paused and Jatharon's fleet held orbital space above Earth. But the cost had been another 100 ships lost and ammunition stocks depleted to levels that would not support extended ground operations. Intelligence reports from surface reconnaissance. The Qualith coordinator announced, displaying data. That painted a picture of Earth's ground defenses that exceeded worst-case projections by orders of magnitude. Every major city had been fortified with weapons emplacements and underground bunkers and tunnel networks connecting civilian and military positions in ways that made distinguishing between them impossible from orbit. And thermal scans showed billions of humans in those cities, rather than the evacuated population centers hegemony doctrine assumed would be standard for any rational species. They are using their entire population as shields, Jatharon said quietly. Understanding finally that humans had no intention of fighting this war according to rules the hegemony considered fundamental to civilized conflicted transmission came from Earth's surface. Not from the military command, but from the unified civilian government that had formed during the war. And a human woman appeared on the view screen with expression that cultural analysis identified as grim determination mixed with satisfaction. Fleet Commander Jatharon, she said, pronouncing his name with effort that suggested human vocal structures struggled with Kryn phonetics. I am Secretary General Maria Santos of the United Earth Government, and I speak for all humanity when I deliver this message. Jatharon gestured for his crew to remain silent and listen to what this human leader had to say, curious despite himself about what words she thought could change the strategic situation. You have fought your way to our homeworld and you believe victory is now inevitable. Santos continued, her image steady despite speaking from a planet under siege. But what you see as victory, we see as merely the beginning of a longer war than your species has. Stomach for the view screen split to show footage from Earth cities, where humans of every age worked in factories and trained with weapons and prepared defensive positions, children alongside adults and elderly alongside. Young in unified purpose that transcended the political divisions that had characterized humanity before the war. We have spent 2 years transforming our entire civilization into a weapon, Santos said as the footage showed the scope of human mobilization. And every person on this planet understands that surrender means the end of human independence and probably the end of our species as anything meaningful. Jatharon watched civilians loading ammunition and wondered what species would arm their children rather than seek terms that would preserve at least some portion of their future, so we offer you a choice. The Secretary General continued, and now her expression hardened into something that translation algorithms struggled to classify, but which Jatharon recognized from a lifetime of combat as the look soldiers wore when they had accepted death, and found peace in that acceptance. You can attempt ground invasion of Earth, and we will fight you for every meter of our world, Santos said calmly, as if discussing whether rather than planetary apocalypse. Every city will require month-long siege, every building will be contested, every human you kill will be replaced by 10 more willing to die rather than submit. The imagery shifted to show weapons caches hidden throughout urban areas and civilians, training in guerrilla tactics and children learning to operate military equipment with casual familiarity that suggested this had become normal part of growing up. During the war, we estimate your ground forces will suffer 90% casualties to conquer Earth's major population centers, she continued, citing numbers that matched Cedaron's own projections. And even then you will face insurgency that will bleed your occupation forces for generations. The fleet commander had seen insurgencies during the hegemony's expansion, and knew that occupying hostile populations required troop commitments that exceeded the forces needed for initial conquest by factors of 10 or more, or, Santos said, and her expression shifted to something that might have been sad smile if human facial muscles worked the way Jatharone's cultural database suggested. You can attempt to exterminate us from orbit and ensure that every species in the galaxy knows the hegemony commits genocide against races that resist subjugation. The political implications of that choice would tear the hegemony, part because member species had signed the coalition's charter based on principles of limited warfare and proportional response. Not planetary extermination, but there is a third option you have not considered, the Secretary General said. And now footage showed something that made Jatharone's combat instincts scream danger. Human colony ships, dozens of them, launching from hidden facilities and using Earth's orbital chaos as cover to escape into deep space on trajectories that would take them beyond the hegemony ability to track or intercept. We sent those ships 18 months ago, Santos explained with satisfaction that bordered on pride, and they carry everything needed to establish new colonies beyond your ability to find. Populations selected for genetic diversity and cultural preservation, and most importantly, they carry the complete record of this war. Jatharone understood immediately what humanity had done and felt cold calculation replace emotion in his tactical assessment of the situation. Those colonists will remember what the hegemony did to Earth, Santos continued, driving the point home with words chosen for maximum impact. And their children will remember, and their children's children will remember. And someday, centuries from now, when you have forgotten about us, they will return. The chamber between stars fell silent as Fleet Commander Jatharone finished his presentation to the High Council. 3 hours of testimony supported by combat footage and casualty statistics and intelligence reports that painted a picture of warfare unlike anything the galactic hegemony had experienced in its 1,000-year history. Ambassador of El-Shara's crystalline structure pulsed with colors that indicated confusion and concern as she processed the data streams showing human tactics and losses the hegemony forces had sustained over 22 months of grinding combat. You are asking this council to negotiate with a Class 7 species, she said, her voice carrying disbelief that resonated through the quantum translation network. A species that has cost us nearly 2,000 warships and accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. Jatharone stood before the assembled representatives of 47 species and felt the weight of their judgment. But his 3 centuries of military service had taught him that sometimes the hardest battles were fought with words rather than weapons. I am asking this council to recognize that humanity has already accomplished something we did not believe possible, he replied, activating holographic displays that showed the war's progression from the initial easy victories to the current stalemate at Earth. They have transformed what should have been a 3-month police action into a 2-year campaign. That has consumed resources equivalent to subduing 3 conventional opponents. The Prime Arbiter leaned forward in the position of authority that species had held since the hegemony's founding. Ancient eyes studying Jatharone with the wisdom accumulated over epochs of galactic politics explain why we should accept anything less than total victory after investing so much in this campaign. The Prime Arbiter commanded, and the question carried weight because political pressure from member species demanded results that justified the casualties and resource expenditures-a-thon manipulated the display to show footage from recent ground combat simulations. Tactical models that demonstrated what invading Earth would require in terms of troops and equipment and time. Ground invasion of Earth will require commitment of forces we do not currently have in system, he began, walking through the logistics. With clinical precision that left no room for optimistic interpretation, human defensive positions are integrated into civilian population centers in ways that make separation impossible without committing war crimes that violate our own charter. The Quoth Hive coordinators stirred in their section of the chamber. Billions of organisms unified in concern about the implications of what they were hearing. Are you suggesting humans would use their own civilians as shields? Crush asked, though the answer was obvious from the intelligence reports everyone had reviewed. Humans do not see a distinction between military and civilian when their species faces extinction, Jatharone replied, showing footage of human children working in munitions factories and elderly operating defensive positions. They have mobilized their entire population for total war in ways we believed were impossible for species at their development level. He pulled up communications intercepts from Earth, showing the unified message across all human media and governmental broadcasts. A species that had set aside every internal conflict to face the external threat with singular purpose. They call it total mobilization. Jatharone continued, and it represents a complete restructuring of their civilization around survival at any cost. Every factory produces weapons. Every farm feeds soldiers. Every school trains fighters. And every person from youngest child to oldest elder serves the war effort ambassador. Velshara's structure flickered with patterns that suggested deep discomfort. With the cultural information being presented, surely this cannot be sustainable, she argued. No species can maintain such intensity of effort indefinitely, without social collapse. Jatharone showed economic data from Earth demonstrating how humans had actually increased production, despite the bombardment and losses. Efficiency. Driven by desperation and unity that defied conventional models of societal behavior under stress, humans appear capable of sustaining this level of mobilization for decades if necessary, he said, citing analysis from cultural experts who had studied human history and found similar patterns during their species' past conflicts, and their psychology suggests they will not surrender even if continuing to fight means mutual annihilation. He activated a recording that showed human prisoners of war, individuals captured during various engagements who had been interviewed by hegemony intelligence to assess morale and willingness to resist. The footage showed humans from different age groups and backgrounds all expressing variations of the same sentiment. That death was preferable to living under hegemony control, and that their sacrifice would be remembered and eventually avenged by survivors. Listen to how they speak of defeat. Jatharone instructed, playing audio of a captured human pilot who smiled when told Earth would fall within months. You think we are losing because you are winning battles. The pilot said with expression that analysis classified as genuine amusement, but we are not trying to win battles. We are trying to make you regret you ever found us. And every day this war continues, we succeed at that goal. The council chamber remained silent as the implications settled across representatives, who had never encountered an enemy that measured victory in terms of their opponent's suffering rather than territorial gains or strategic objectives. Jatharone showed casualty. Projections for ground invasion that assumed human resistance would match or exceed what hegemony forces had already experienced during urban combat on Mars and other colonies. 90% casualties, minimum to secure Earth's major population centers, he stated flatly, and that assumes humans fight with conventional tactics rather than the improvised weapons and suicide attacks they have demonstrated willingness to employ. The numbers appeared in the holographic display, and several council members recoiled from the stark mathematics of what conquering Earth would cost in lives and resources even if we accept such losses. Jatharone continued, moving to the next phase of his argument. We then face occupation of a planet with billions of hostile inhabitants who have proven they will use any method including terrorism to resist. Foreign control, historical analysis from humanity's own wars showed how insurgencies could persist for generations against occupying forces. And the hegemony had no experience with the kind of protracted guerrilla warfare that human cultural patterns suggested would follow. Conquest occupation would require troop commitments that exceed our current military strength, Jatharone said, showing logistics models that demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining control over Earth while defending other hegemony territories would likely continue for centuries given human cultural tendency to remember grievances and pass them to future generations. Self-collective pulsed with electromagnetic confusion that translated as fundamental inability to comprehend the strategic situation, then we exterminate them. The Sylph suggested with the clinical detachment of beings who had transcended physical vulnerability. Orbital bombardment until the planet is sterilized and humanity ceases to exist as a threat. Jatharone had anticipated this argument and prepared his response carefully because this represented the greatest danger. That the Council would choose genocide as the simplest solution to an intractable problem. Exterminating humanity would require weapons we have specifically forbidden since the founding of the hegemony, he said, showing the charter provisions. That prohibited planetary destruction, except under the most extreme circumstances. And using such weapons would fundamentally alter the political compact that holds our episodal Coalition together, he displayed analysis from the hegemony's political scientists, showing how member species would react to genocide committed for the crime of resisting subjugation. And the projections suggested the coalition would fracture within a generation as species reconsidered whether security was worth membership in an organization capable of such actions. But there is a more immediate concern, Chathron said. And now he showed the footage that had convinced him to halt the invasion and request this emergency council session. The display showed human colony ships escaping during the chaos of orbital combat, vessels that had launched from hidden facilities, and used sophisticated evasion techniques to disappear into deep space beyond tracking capability. Intelligence estimates between 50 and 80 colony ships successfully escaped our detection net. He reported, each carrying thousands of humans and complete records of this war, including detailed analysis of hegemony. Weapons and tactics. The council chamber erupted in multiple languages as representatives grasped the implications, and Jatherone waited for order to be restored before continuing his testimony. Those ships are heading into unexplored regions beyond our ability to pursue, he said over the dying chaos. And they carry populations specifically, selected for genetic diversity and cultural preservation, with the explicit purpose of ensuring humanity survives, even if Earth is destroyed. Ambassador Velshera's structure pulsed with alarm as she processed the strategic implications of human survivors. Scattered across unknown space with knowledge of hegemony capabilities and motivation for revenge,